Welcome back, true believers. We're here once again to discuss Star Trek Prodigy, Season 1, Episode 16, this time entitled Preludes. If you are new here or just forgot or for other reasons, you don't know what's going on, there will be spoilers ahead, so please back out now if that's not your thing. Otherwise, consider yourself warned, and we're cracking on into this episode. So as I said, this is entitled Preludes, and I do believe that is a very, very apt title because that is basically the entire premise of this show. If you recall, last episode ended with our crew valiantly escaping from the Romulan Tal Shiar agents behind the neutral zone, getting back to the Protostar. Ankana ran away, so I don't know what's going on with him. Hopefully he comes back. If you watch my last episode, you'll know how I feel about him dipping out. They're basically trying to repair the ship, get it back up to snuff, so that they can escape from the Romulan neutral zone, but at the same time, they're still also trying to avoid Starfleet due to that whole secret weapon that's going to infect them with some futuristic virus, whatever that stuff. So our crew, while in the engine room trying to get the ship up and running, decide to have a little story time. Dal is feeling down on himself, basically feeling that because he's genetically augmented, he doesn't have a family, he's got this tragic backstory that nobody can relate to, and the rest of the characters say, you know what? On this ship, you can't feel that way because we all have a tragic backstory, and then they decide to go into their stories, and we get little snippets of where they all came from. So we see at the beginning, on the Dauntless, Janeway is receiving a report from, I'm assuming, Admiral Jellicoe. They don't say him by name, but they did reference an admiral got this information, so I'm choosing to believe Jellicoe is still involved here. And he sends over this pad full of data on who these characters, who these children are. I don't know why they did it this way. It's like they gave this pad to Admiral Janeway with these little data points on the characters, only to cut back to the Protostar and have the characters tell their own backstories. I personally thought they were going to show these backstories based on what Janeway was reading. It felt like a little bit of a missed opportunity, though. Why even bring that into the mix if that wasn't going to be the storytelling framework they were using? That's a small nitpick. So we get to see our characters, where they came from. Specifically, we start out with Rok-Tahk. I guess a character we didn't know that much about prior to her joining the crew and joining the fleet. It turns out that there was some sort of, I'm not entirely sure what they called it, a galactic wrestling group or something along the lines of there was this guy who was playing the hero and she was hired to play the monster. So in essence, they were doing some sort of faux wrestling, fighting, where it seemed like the big scary monster played by Rok-Tahk was going to get the best of this hero, but he would always come through in the end and gain that victory. It was this cute little relationship, and then it turns out that she wanted a little more out of it. She wasn't feeling fulfilled. So one night she decided to turn things on its head, become the hero herself, and defeat, in a bumbling manner, this hero. She does it, has a good time, but it turns out this actually caused a problem. She ended up getting sold off to slavers. So that was her backstory. Then we kick off with Zero's backstory. And this was an interesting one because this is the first time we've really seen Medusans in, I don't want to say their natural habitat because it wasn't, but these Medusans had gone out there exploring. We got to see a cool shot in the background of their ship. It was awesome seeing these energy beings kind of differentiating themselves with the colors and the flashing and the shining of their lights. It's definitely something I feel works probably better in an animated series than it would if you were doing this in straight up live action. And they were exploring, and while exploring, well, she was captured by a band of Kazon. They were wearing those neat little visors from the original series, and that's how she got sold into slavery. Well, I guess Zero is technically a they. I keep saying she. Zero is actually non-gendered because it's an energy being, so I guess I shouldn't give them a gender. The one I found probably to be the best, and the one that has the most far-reaching implications to the Star Trek universe as a whole, is Jankum Pog. It was multi-layered, so while Rok-Tahk's was tragic and sad based especially on what we know she's gone through in the show, being caught in that time warp and everything, Jankum's was kind of bittersweet and also funny, and also informed the character quite a bit, and ties back to a very early period in Star Trek history. He was in some sort of prolonged hibernation, cryosleep, whatever you want to call it, on this long-term colony ship or long-term sleeper ship, sent out prior to the Federation even being founded. This is Enterprise era, possibly even prior to the events that took place in Enterprise. There were some problems on the ship that needed fixing. He was the only one to be resuscitated, so he had to in essence, figure out and solve all these problems with no more help than a droid that really wasn't helpful. And we got to see in this point, Jankum Pog learning all of these things, learning the abilities to kind of cobble together a solution to engineering problems. It wasn't real life training, it was on the job figuring it out and needing to get that done. We also learned that after all of these events transpire, he finally fixes every little thing on the ship. He has exhausted far too much of the oxygen supply on the ship by exerting himself to do all these repairs, and that is not able to sustain all of the other members of the crew, and the only recourse is for him to leave the ship in an escape pod to save the lives of everybody else in stasis. Not to mention, we also got to learn that this weird droid thing was not responding to him in the correct way, and the only way to get the thing to respond to him was to consistently and constantly use his full name, and that was a kind of a nice way to find out why he as a Tellarite is speaking so much differently than other Tellarites and always referring to himself by his full name. That's because it was basically a learned behavior that was required for his survival on this ship because of that stupid droid that is apparently the bane of his existence. Eventually, after he jettisons himself from the ship to save the crew, he is captured by one of the things that I was not that pleased about. So we discover here all of our characters were captured and sold into slavery or otherwise just brokered by one race, the Kazon. I don't know if this is necessarily a bad thing or not. I didn't care for it 100% because I just never felt the Kazon from Voyager to be that effectual. Sure, they caused issues and problems for Voyager, but it was one lone ship in the Delta Quadrant that just had to deal with their shenanigans. It seems here that they're a lot more competent, and perhaps they've come together and become more competent because of the actions of meeting Voyager. But either way, I was just a little unimpressed by their inclusion here. It makes sense. I'm just not a huge fan of them, and I feel like maybe if they juggled that up a little bit, had a couple other races or species included in there, that would have been fine too. We also finally got the entire backstory of what happened to Chakotay. So we got all of these backstories being thrown at us in this episode. While the plots weren't really moved forward, there was very little new learned except for at the very end with Janeway, but I'll get back to that later. But we got all this backstory, so now that we know where we're coming from, we can thrust forward and probably come to some sort of resolution here soon. So Chakotay, and this ties in very, very well with some things we've learned before, ran into some sort of temporal rift. He was shot forward, I think, 50 years into the future, and that is why there's been no sign of him. There was no way for him to get a message, because he is not trapped anywhere on our timeline. He is in the future. He was captured by the Diviner's people. He was put in prison with the rest of his crew. I don't know how many there were or how many survived. We really only saw a couple of them. But at the last moment, he and at least one other crew member managed to escape and set the Protostar on autopilot back into the past. And it wasn't just the past he left from. He sent it even further into the past prior to the entire events of Voyager, somewhere along the lines of the first seasons of TNG, that time frame. So the Protostar arrived that much further back in time than when it left. We also get the rest of the backstory with the Diviner, and as we discovered last episode, there is another member of his race that was hiding as the Trill on the Dauntless under Janeway's command. And she came equipped with her own dreadnought, and we discover is once Chakotay sent the Protostar back in time, they assembled a group of, I believe, 50 ships, each crewed with one individual and one dreadnought-class droid, or whatever you want to call them, and they each just kind of shot back in that temporal rift, hoping at least one or two of them would arrive somewhere in the vicinity of where the Protostar landed so that they could get that ship and enact that revenge on the Federation and all that stuff. We discover that the other member left at the same time, but she arrived much more recently, and that's why she is not aged at all, considering the Diviner is aged almost to the point of death. So she infiltrated herself in the Starfleet somehow to join this Dauntless crew under Janeway. Not entirely sure if she created a false backstory from the start, if she impersonated someone who already existed. I have to imagine, though, that she was in Starfleet or the Federation for quite a decent period of time. And I'm just not entirely sure that the values and the stuff that she's seen of Starfleet and the Federation hasn't rubbed off on her. She seems at this point to be 100% just geared on figuring out her mission, completing her mission and all of that stuff. but I have to imagine some of the Starfleet and Federation stuff has rubbed off on her, and she may come around to being more on their side than she seems at this point. We also get to discover here that the Diviner now basically kind of has all of his marbles back in his head, and he's willing and able to knock out Janeway when she comes in the room. So now it seems as if the Dauntless is in bad hands, and the Protostar is repaired and juiced up and ready to go. So I think come next episode, we're actually going to get a pretty significant showdown or something. Everything seems to be building to a head. Was this the best episode of the season? No. It kind of slowed the ongoing storyline to a halt, but I think that was in a good way because a lot of this backstory really helps. It really informs who our characters are. The only downside I would have is we're 16 episodes in, and the fact that we're 16 episodes in and our characters are only just now beginning to share information about themselves, I feel that's a little bit iffy. Like, I have to imagine some of this would have been brought up before now, and I think that's where maybe having Admiral Janeway as the framing device with all of these backstories on her pad would have felt a little more genuine, but then we would have lost the emotional resonance we were supposed to gain from everybody kind of showing Dal that everything isn't as bad as he thinks and that he's not the only misfit. He is created from all sorts of different genetic material using augment DNA, including Q DNA. My personal theory is that DNA came from Quinn on Voyager when he was turned into a mortal before he offed himself, because a lot of the DNA that was also shown in there, aside from just generic species that their DNA would be everywhere, seems to be from Voyager, seems to be Delta Quadrant DNA, and if the Federation was using that, the only reasonable place they would have received that DNA is from the returning Voyager. So, if they were using returning DNA from Voyager, Quinn's DNA from when he was turned mortal would also be in the file. What happens when a Q turns mortal? What kind of DNA do they have? I can't imagine the actual Q have DNA, because that's just a little weird. I don't think they're actually corporeal beings, but I guess who am I to say that? All in all, this was another fine episode, a lot of backstory, a lot of cool Star Trek things thrown in, a lot of references to Star Trek things that just aren't brought up that much. I love that we're getting more Tellarite stuff here, and especially pre-Federation Enterprise era stuff being brought into this, but at the same time, we're expanding and extending the universe that we've come to know. Another episode that's just blowing it out of the water compared to a lot of the other Star Trek offerings right now, and I think that's a detriment to people that aren't watching this show, because this really is where a lot of the core of Star Trek is taking place right now. But what are your thoughts? Are you liking where the show is going? Do you think the direction is great? What do you think about the mystery with Janeway and Chakotay and all that stuff? Leave all your thoughts below, leave a like, subscribe, do all those fancy things, and until next time, computer, end program.